Hugh, following on from what Prime Minister Trudeau was just saying about gender inequity, we've also seen in this conflict in Ukraine racial inequity come to the fore. In the early days of this crisis, as millions fled, thousands of international students also left Ukraine. Among them were thousands of Africans and Indians who were in Ukraine studying. And we all read and saw the images of the struggles that they face as they try to get out of that besieged country. What are your thoughts on what needs to be done to ensure that in these moments of crisis, governments don't pit the marginalized and the vulnerable against each other at a time when really collective humanity should take precedence?
Thank you for your question, Asha. I think that firstly, we saw early on in this conflict a scandalous double standard in the way that some refugees from other races, backgrounds, creed or colour were treated. And I think that rightly so, people were justifiably outraged at that. It shouldn't have happened. And we know that the refugee experience is universal. Thankfully, as President von der Leyen outlined, the EU has said that refugees fleeing from Ukraine can live, work and study across the EU bloc. And I think that Irina in her comments was touching on something really important. I started my activism journey when I was 14 years old in the Philippines, and I lived in India for a year when I was 15. And I saw in India that we need to address these issues systemically, not just as a result of charitable gestures. And so the rules that we're seeing apply here need to become the rule, not the exception to the rule for other refugee crises around the world. What we need to see is that moving forward, this becomes the standards for all of those who are fleeing war due to, say, violence or persecution or climate change, as you highlighted, irrespective of race, religion, creed or colour. And this worldwide refugee crisis from Yemen to Afghanistan is grossly underfunded. If you consider that in Yemen, they've received just $1 billion of the total $4 billion package requested, or in South Sudan, less than 10% of the total $1.2 billion needed. Now, what does this underfunding mean? It ultimately means that kids don't get access to school. There is chronic malnutrition that persists. And so we have to ultimately hold world leaders accountable to make sure they live up to their international obligations. I was saddened recently when the UK government decided to slash $5 billion from their foreign aid budget. It's not necessary. You know, we know that at the same time the UK government initiated an enormous bailout for people during COVID. It's time that refugees get that bailout.
I want to talk to you about something specific, Hugh. Even before the invasion began, we know that global humanitarian aid budgets were already being strained, that not just humanitarian aid budgets, but development budgets as well were under severe strain after 2 years of the COVID-19 pandemic. I've got to ask you, again, considering this is one of the core drivers of Global Citizens' work, how will this invasion impact efforts to reduce poverty and hunger, and what must governments do?
Thank you, Asha. So I think, firstly, it's important to acknowledge that during the pandemic alone, 120 million people were pushed into extreme poverty as a result of COVID-19, even before this invasion occurred. And we know that hunger has been on the rise in the last 4 years. We know that climate change continues to be one of these generation's greatest challenges, I believe, alongside the challenge of ending extreme poverty. And we also know that right now in Ethiopia, they're suffering from one of the worst climate-induced droughts in decades. This was all before the invasion. The invasion is going to exacerbate these currently existing challenges. At the same time, because governments are facing so many competing pressures, as we're talking about, pressure to invest in this or this, I think the question we have to grapple with is this is really not a question of wallet, it's a question of will. Because we've seen how governments can rally in times of crisis. We saw it during the pandemic where trillions of dollars were invested when it was necessary. And I would argue right now it's absolutely necessary to invest into the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, because we're then investing in the future of women and girls, we're investing in the future of our planet, and we're investing in everyone's shared prosperity. And that's why I'm really proud to work alongside Prime Minister Trudeau and President Ursula von der Leyen, because I think these are world leaders who exemplify big tent foreign policy rather than zero-sum thinking. I think we need to encourage leaders that really encourage a big tent philosophy, not a zero-sum game where one person's benefit is another person's loss. This is a world where we have adequate resources. We need to allocate those resources accordingly. And so I believe now is the time to double down, and as we head towards really ongoing efforts to mobilize global citizens around the world, this intersection between democracy and the eradication of extreme poverty has been stronger now more than ever. We need to really uphold and support world leaders who invest in the future of our planet.